Do you want to learn how to draw underwater scenes like these? Hi, my name is Oyun Orka, a VTuber who tries to draw, and in this video, let's go in depth on how you can draw underwater scenes. I'll go over the basics of colors underwater, techniques to paint water surfaces and water caustics, do a drawing demo, and even share a free Clip Studio Paint brush pack to help you draw underwater scenes even easier. So without further ado, let's get started with colors underwater. So if you're trying to draw something underwater, in order for the subject to feel more like it's underwater, you need to understand that certain colors are less visible the deeper that you go underwater. Assuming regular conditions underwater, colors towards red on the visible light spectrum get absorbed first, and blue gets absorbed last. So generally, the deeper that you go underwater, the more blue or cooler in hue something will appear because the other colors are absorbed first. This is also why on a sunny day, water generally appears blue, because while water inherently doesn't have a color, it absorbs blue last, so that's the color that's reflected back at us. Using this photo that I took as an example, you'll see that even with extremely clear aquarium water and under bright light, if you color pick parts of this wooden pillar, even without going all that deep, the warmer colors of the wood start to shift towards a cooler tone as more of the light gets absorbed. So going back to our earlier example, the easiest way to make a subject feel like they're underwater is to just shift the colors to be more blue. And you can do that by, for example, using a dark blue multiply gradient, clip that to the character, and set it to multiply like so. Of course, for characters closer to the surface, because less of the colors get absorbed, you can also lighten the effect of this, so a good way to indicate how deep your subject is underwater could be based on the intensity of the colors being absorbed. Another thing to note when drawing subjects underwater is that because of the particulate matter in the water, objects further from you get hazier and hazier as the light gets absorbed by the water. As you can see here, the coral closer to the viewer is more warm in hue compared to the coral that's further. So to get that sort of effect in your art, you can either reduce the intensity of the colors, or color pick the water and do a lighter opacity overlay of that on objects that are further away from the viewer in underwater scenes. So now let's get into water surfaces. So you might have seen these squiggly circles underwater before. These are called water caustics. They form because when the light passes through the water's surface, the uneven surface makes the water act as sort of a prism and creates these slight refractions that you see here. In terms of the actual water surface, depending on how rough or calm the water is, as well as the angle that you're viewing it at, you might also get some of the scene beneath the water reflected onto the surface of the water, but this is highly dependent on the angle. If you're looking at water from below and then looking upwards, then you might notice that sometimes you're able to see part of the sky in this circular area, and the area around that is either dark or a reflection of the objects below. This phenomenon is called Snell's window, and you can pause to read the definition here if you'd like, but essentially the area outside Snell's window will be either completely dark or show a reflection of the underwater objects by total internal reflection. So using another photo as an example, here you'll see that because of the low angle that this was taken at, and also because the water is relatively calm, we can see through the water towards the top because of the angle, and towards the edge of this angle, it will instead be dark or show a reflection of the bottom. So now that we've covered some basic terminology, let's go into actually applying it in a drawing demo. Now before getting to actually drawing an illustration here, I'm first going to demonstrate how to draw different parts of typical underwater scenes so you can apply these to your own illustrations as needed. So let's say that this is a typical underwater scene where light is coming from the top of the canvas, and we have some sort of sand or bottom of the sea visible right here. Because we covered earlier that as things get further from you underwater, it's less visible, let's just do a sort of airbrush here in the center of this canvas to indicate that the further away from the canvas, it's less visible and sort of like dark and murky here. Next, for the water surface itself, you can typically think of water surfaces sort of like a plane, and not the airplane kind. So imagine you have a flat grid like this. So depending on the angle you're looking at the water surface from, if it's something like this, then here we'll be able to do the sort of Snell's window effect that we covered earlier. In order to get that effect, on a new layer, you can use any sort of pressure-sensitive painterly brush and just do these sorts of circular strokes like this. What's helpful for me is first doing this sort of circle-like thing here, just to determine at what angle is the cutoff point for Snell's window. And then at the edges, just sort of doing these sorts of lines here to indicate the ripple of the water. Essentially, the strokes I'm making are just kind of like these curved wave shapes, and then just sort of layering them on top of each other in this area. You can also set your brush to erase, and then erase from this as well to get sharper edges, and also to just sort of erase from the main body area slightly as well. Once you're happy with this shape, go ahead and lock transparent pixels on this, and then assuming that you want a bright blue sky here, set the color to a light blue, go ahead and do a gradient for the sky if you'd like, and next go ahead and duplicate this layer, and then on the layer beneath that, go ahead and do filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then it'll easily add this sort of like glowy effect on the edge. Something I also like to do is have sort of the sun sort of peeking out just on the edges here to get that really bright sunny underwater effect. And then using any sort of opacity sensitive brush, you can just lightly make these sorts of sun rays coming down from here too if you'd like. Alternatively, if you don't want a very low angle, going back to our plane from earlier, if instead you want to kind of be looking at the surface from more of the side instead of bottom to top, you can get that sort of effect by kind of doing the wavy brush strokes that we did earlier, but just making them larger the closer that they are to the viewer or like on this plane here, and then smaller the further it is away from us. Also, if part of the surface is sort of cutting into the camera and you can see part of the sky, you can just first identify where you want the edge of the water to be and then in the sky, and then do a slightly curved line like this, where you can vary the line pressure as you draw this. So this way, this section is sort of the water surface that will be reflecting part of the sky, and then this plane underneath is the underwater section that will be reflecting more of the sand. And sort of keeping that in mind, something that I like to do is to just add a little bit of highlights along this edge or line here, and then go ahead and paint in roughly the water surface sort of like this. Here, I'll just go ahead and use a color for the sand and then just lightly brush in this sort of gradient here. And then to draw water caustics, essentially the way that I like to think of it is to just draw a sort of really weird oval shape, and then sort of like connect that to another one, and another one, and another one like this. And then as I'm drawing this, I'm using an opacity sensitive brush, but you can use any sort of brush that you'd like, depending on what sort of look you want to go for. Depending on the style that you want to go for, you can also use a more harder brush like this, or an even softer brush and sort of layer on the circles to make it look more realistic. So very roughly, we can sort of make these water caustics here, set the layer to add glow, use airbrush and then just lightly erase from the edges, turn down the opacity of this a little bit, and then there we have very rough water caustics like this. Also, if you're not a fan of doing this manually, I have an underwater brush pack available on Clip Studio Paint for free, which you can download on the link in the description below. Using our brush pack, along with the knowledge that we just covered earlier, let's go ahead and draw an illustration. So I'll go ahead and first start out by sketching some thumbnails, and then once deciding on the thumbnail or idea that I want to go with, I'll go ahead and draw in the character. Since the focus of this tutorial is not on how to draw characters or compose scenes, I'll skip over this part. But if you're interested in learning how I draw things or how I plan scenes, check out the video linked on the corner of the screen here. Now that we finished drawing the character, based on the thumbnail sketch that I did, I'm going to go ahead and plan in the sea color, and then primarily use these two photos that I took as reference for the background and colors. And then using the Underwater 1 brush from my brush pack, I'll go ahead and layer in where I want the water surface to be. I'll also go ahead and use the Underwater 2 and 3 brush just on the edges here to add a little bit more interest. Once that's done, since this was done on a new layer, I'll go ahead and lock transparent pixel, use airbrush to brush in the sky gradient, and then use airbrush to brush in some sun rays coming through the water. After that, I'll also go ahead and add some little bubbles here in the water as well. Once that's done, I'll go ahead and draw in the shipwreck using colors primarily based on the reference on the left, and use a mix of my O-tilt brush, as well as the sand brush for some extra texture. Next, after adding the sand, I'll go ahead and add some mossy underwater rocks here, and then just play around with the colors a little bit. Once I'm done with the rock base, I'll go ahead and use my coral brushes to add in some corals. Now that we have the rocks and corals and the base shape of the shipwreck pretty much done, I'll go ahead and add the color and texture for the shipwreck. I'm primarily color picking from this photo that I took at an aquarium, and using the sand brush to make sure that it's pretty textured here. This is sort of just to get an old, decaying shipwreck look. After adding some more rocks in the background and then using an airbrush to just kind of erase from the bottom a little bit, just so that it sort of recedes into the background, I'll go ahead and use my varied fish brush and brush in some fishes. I play around with the fishes quite a bit and ultimately decide I don't want any fish too close to the viewer just because I don't want things to compete for attention here. Once I'm pretty much satisfied with the background, here I'll go ahead and add shading and lighting to the character. I'll first color pick a blue from the background, set that to multiply and overlay that over the character, and then on a new layer, I'll use my water caustics brush to just brush in where I want the water caustics to be. Also, going back to the shipwreck, I'll use the same water caustics brush, clip that to the shipwreck, and then just brush that on top of the shipwreck. I'll go ahead and blur some parts of this as well. Another thing to note with water caustics is because they're essentially coming from the light on the water surface onto the character, in areas where there's shadow, the water caustics should not be visible, so I'll go ahead and erase from parts where there's shadow. And then so going back to the character, once I've identified the primary source of light, and then add some very faint bounce light, I'll go ahead and click Selection from Layer, go back to the water caustics layer, and then click Delete Outside Selection Area. Now, the water caustics are only visible where there's light shining on the character. Finally, I'll go ahead and use airbrush and overlay layers to add some finishing touches, correct some of the colors a little bit, add blur filters, and then also an RGB shift on the side, and we're done. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would appreciate if you give this video a like, and subscribe if you'd like to see more from my channel. Also, if you'd like to learn more about how I draw underwater scenes, check out this video linked on screen here with 3 examples on how I draw underwater scenes. I'll see you next time. Bye bye!